asked me to take up where he left off. So growing up, my father had an OK CO2 engine in the package sitting on the windowsill in his workshop. And when I got old enough, he let me play with that. So I had been building free flight models, so I built a free flight model I thought was appropriate and mounted the engine, and I got this long extended glide out of it. But it seemed like a neat way of powering a model airplane. I was tired of winding up rubber bands. And the guy that ran the hobby shop that I probably darn near lived at growing up said, hey, there's a guy, this was in the early 70s, a guy in Pennsylvania that's making some new CO2 engines. Do you want me to try to get you one? And I said, yeah, I'd like to do that. So I took, when it came in, I took my SIG Cub and took the rubber band and prop off and mounted the CO2 engine on it. And the only problem, well, I took it out that night, after I mounted it. And it was dark, and I had a street light out in front of my house. And, the neat thing about a CO2 engine is that they're throttleable. So I throttled it down, launched the airplane, and I was amazed. It was, ticking over, and it was maintaining as it came around. And I thought this was great, but by the time it came around to where I was, it was 6 inches out of my reach, So it circled up, got above the street light, so of course it disappeared, and I was chasing this ghost across the backyards of my, neighborhood. Couldn't find the airplane that night, had to get up at crack of dawn the next morning and go find it. But that was the only problem with it, is that it kept landing in trees. It weighed less than the motor and assembly weighed less than the rubber band, and so the model flew way too long. So my father had bought an Alban receiver and a Bennett actuator, and I decided that I needed to put that radio in the airplane. So I built a 4.5-ounce model, and that's how I learned how to fly radio control, because this thing would fly for about 100 seconds, and I could bring it back and land it at my feet. And it flew slow enough that I could move the stick and say, nope, that's not where I want to go, and I wanted to go the other direction, and that taught me how to fly towards myself and everything else. So I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about what a CO2 engine is. It's really an ambient temperature steam engine. You're putting liquid CO2 in the tank, and the stored heat energy in the aluminum and the ambient temperature boils the CO2, and then it runs kind of like a steam engine, but it's the valving is a little bit simpler. And they're real hard to charge. Remember, the CO2, when it's in liquid form, is at about 1,000 psi at room temperature. They're real hard starting, but one of the neat features is that they're throttled. So for a free flight model, this is a really neat power source. So at that point in time, I had the OK CO2 engine and the one that Bill Brown was making, and I was flying radio control models. I discovered pretty quickly that I could fly that in the high school gym, because we flew Friday nights in a high school gym. And I couldn't quite understand why everybody was so excited that I was flying radio control, but at the time, this was the radios that everybody else was flying, so having an airplane that weighed 4 ounces was, I guess, pretty exciting for a lot of people. So, like I said, I had an OK and the Brown engine, and then I heard that in the late 40s that there were some other engines made, a Campus A100 that was smaller, and I decided I needed to find one of those, and then I'd have all 3 of the CO2 engines that were produced. And it took me a long time to find the A100. And then I started hearing about, gee, there was a bigger one, and I found that engine, and then they started producing them in England, and all of a sudden that collection of engines is now over 100 different makes and models of CO2 engines. So again, in this early 70s into the early 80s, I was flying rudder-only models. You got to remember that that was the only available power source that was light, that you could, power a model that weighed, an ounce or less, with. And like Henry, played with some electrics and, took the Mattel Superstars and modified them with bigger batteries and rudder-only systems in them and flew those. And they were fun, but still, we didn't have the radios to control the throttle on those at all. So the CO2 was a neat way to fly indoors, RC. Then I got a real job and didn't pay a lot of attention to the small RC stuff anymore. But I was watching what was going on in the industry. So we had rare earth magnets, and that was going to make a dramatic difference to the actuators. All of a sudden the actuator could be in the tail instead of in the middle of the airplane. When John Worth came out with the Cloud9 newsletter and Microflight newsletter, and all of a sudden radios became available. And Bill Brown had gotten with Stefan Gasparin to make the GB12, which is 12 cubic millimeters. So that's about a 3/32 inch bore and stroke engine. It's pretty tiny. And in John's newsletter, he talked about Fritz Mueller making a limited number of, the Alden style of receivers, and I think he only made 10 or 12 of them. And I quickly contacted John and said, what would it take to get one of those? And he decided I needed one, and he gave me got me one of the receivers, and with the Fritz's bird actuator in the tail and the GB12 in the nose. All of a sudden I was flying a 10-inch airplane that weighed a half an ounce, that was radio controlled, and I flew that airplane quite a bit, had landing gear and the radio on it. And then let's see what else happened there. Stefan Gasparin in Czechoslovakia, when the Iron Curtain fell, Stefan had set a Guinness Book of World Records with a 1 cubic millimeter CO2 engine, a pretty tiny little engine. And by that point, he had a 2.6 cubic millimeter that was performing pretty well, that were available for sale. And with one of Nick's radios, I ended up building a 8-inch monoplane, radio control model that, I don't know, weighed 6 grams or something, probably less than that. So the CO2 is an interesting way of flying. I was demonstrating the RC version of this airplane at the DCRC meeting one time, and they asked me to talk about what I was doing, and I talked about it, but then I could flip the prop and launch it and fly it over the crowd, in figure eights, and brought it back and caught it in landing. And Fred Marks, who designed a lot of the ACE radios, I was using his transmitters for the pulse proportional radios and things at the time, walked up to me and said, hey, electrics are, I understand the little electrics are getting, better. And at that time, the Brown engine, I think, weighed 2.5 grams with the tank and the propeller. And at that instant in time, we were still using 50 milliamp NiCads were the smallest ones that you had. You had to have, 3 of them to power the radio and the motor. And I said, Fred, when do you think we're going to have a motor and batteries that is equivalent to the 2.5 grams of the GB12? And he said, yeah, you're right. And he turned and walked away. Well, within a couple of years, we had pager motors and LiPo, cells to power and they got way smaller than the 2.5 grams for the GB12. So I always felt kind of dumb about that, that I couldn't see that things were getting better. But for an awful long time, NiCads were the only power source that you had to power an airplane with, and it just didn't get better, and all of a sudden it got dramatically better with the. So some people ask why I'm still playing with CO2, because I tell them that the electric airplanes don't have enough moving parts. So that's why I'm still, seeing what can be done with CO2. So last night was the first time we really had a chance to fly a CO2 powered model that has a radio controlled throttle on it. So that was kind of exciting. That was a goal for a lot of years. And even though we had engines that had throttles on them that were easily throttleable, we didn't have radios that were small enough. And now we've got smaller radios, and I've got somebody that helps me build stuff now, so that helps a lot too. Stefan Gasparin, when the Iron Curtain collapsed, he was hooked up with machine shops that built aircraft instruments for the Russian Air Force, and that market disappeared. So he had a lot of they had a lot of time and the equipment to make parts, and would love to get US dollars. So the machine shop machined all the parts, and on the smaller engines, Stefan assembled them all themselves, but that machine shop also assembled some of the bigger engines. And to expand the market, engines were made in just about every configuration that a real airplane engine was made. So there were radials made that were 1.5 inches in diameter, twin row, 18-cylinder engines. Got a V12 that's 2.5 inches long. 4-cylinder, 3-cylinder radials, 3-cylinder fan configurations like the Anzanis, and just about every configuration that a real engine was made. So I think there was 35 or so different models that Stefan Gasparin made. I've got all the singles and twins, I think, just about that he made, but I had to give up on all the multi-cylinder ones. So that just got to be a little bit much and a little too expensive.
And then he made electric brushless motors.
And then he made electric brushless motors.
And they were as beautiful as anything else he made.
Exactly.
You hang on to them as a work of art, only to go in
I've got one.
Did you cry a little bit when he kind of switched over to electric?
So
yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
So a little known fact: when we found the little 7mm super slick car motors,
right.
I would be driving around to different Toys R Us's.
Yeah,
Scrounging, like, oh, they got a batch. I would like buy
Right.
all of the right colors, and then I was literally boxing these up and shipping them to Stefan. And then he was making these wonderful, he was putting little pinions on them and making little
Right.
gearboxes. And the thing about Stefan is, like, it was before, everything needed to be in trade.
Right, right.
So I'll get you these super slick, and you never sort of kept track of it, but some wonderful stuff would show up.
Exactly.
Was that the cars that had like the green motor?
Yeah,
okay.
those are
Right.
ones. And the people like, who is this guy like rummaging around in Toys R Us? Like, I got a guy in Eastern Europe who needs these.
Exactly. I had a gentleman in Germany that was into the CO2s, and like you said, you never kept track of what you would send him or what he sent you back.
It all works out.
You knew you were winning all the time, because you got stuff that you had no idea existed, So that's a little bit of the history that I've had with CO2. Has anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Oh,
Go first.
I noticed you have like a display case of the CO2 motors.
Right.
And I noticed like some of them seem to be newer. Is that like an evolution of like one line, or are they just a collection of different
Okay,
ones you
these
have?
are all the CO2 engines. Bill Brown, that's a quick, interesting story. Bill Brown is the gentleman that's credited with producing the first production internal combustion model airplane engines. designed the high school engine when he was in high school. Nobody thought he could do it, and they were very disturbed. His father, in particular, was very disturbed when all this noise came out of the machine shop in the back of the house. You know, he made the engine run. His father then went out and found people to invest in starting a company to produce these model engines. And this was Brown Junior Motors. And some of those investors were the DuPonts and the Pulitzers. We were the only people in 1934 had enough money to raise $40,000 for the tooling to mass produce the Brown Junior Motors. Bill and his dad were not owners of the company, they were employees of the company, you know, and there's some interesting stories there. But after the war, Bill was a model airplane builder, so he went to a model airplane contest, and they were flying the rubber band powered Baby Rogue free flight models, little free flight models. And he walked up to one of the competitors and asked them, "Gee, if you could replace the rubber band with an engine, would that be a good idea?" And it got a positive reaction. So he developed the CO2 engine, and the first one was the A100, which had an 1/8" bore and stroke. And he set up campus engineering at, I think it was Penn State. It may have been, it was in Philadelphia. It was to teach the college students how to run a company, produce something and sell it. So they produced two different size engines, the A100 and the Campus B, which was 3/16" bore and stroke. And some of them were pretty good and set some records, and some of them weren't so good, weren't fit tight enough and things. So when Bill retired from his real job in the 70s, he had been thinking about all the improvements that could be made and started producing the, it's called the 005, and that was the first engine that Henry, I think, played with a lot, and that was pretty dramatic engine. It has a hardened steel piston that's lapped to a steel cylinder. Really close tolerances. And as things evolved, there were, engines evolved. We built the two-cylinder, the MJ70, the MJ140. Finally came up with what he called the Peanut engine, which was a redesigned A100. So by this time he was figuring out metric system was pretty neat, and so the numbers all had to do with the how many cubic millimeters they were. So this was the A23, 1/8" bore and stroke, but 23 cubic millimeters. And so that evolved into the B100 and the B200 two-cylinder engines. Davis Diesel had an idea that it would be great if he built conversion heads for a lot of the glow engines to make them diesels. So he wanted to sell a conversion to make some of the Cox engines CO2. So he got Bill to make him the fuel systems and modify some of the heads so that you can convert a Cox engine. And the only issue with a Cox engine is that the piston cylinder fit really isn't close enough to be really good.
They were tracking machining Cox. Those were like millions of inches or something.
Exactly.
I remember reading it.
And Bill figured he didn't really have a way of measuring piston and cylinder fit, but he figured as best he could figure that it was within, it had to be less than 2/millionths of an inch. The piston cylinder fit to be good enough to get the performance he wanted. Straight.
Because also with CO2, right, that piston's not expanding when it's running.
Right.
Because you've got no heat there.
Okay, right.
So it worked fine for the Cox because the piston would grow.
Yeah.
And also you weren't running thick oil like the castor oil based, Cox, oil. But they do run amazingly, well.
Joe, I went over to Bill helping do some A23s, and
Right.
he had a whole series of hones, and he
Right.
could hone them and hand fit each one until it was right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, wouldn't they have to not only have the head modification with the valve, but they'd have to change the piston, right? With the pin on it, or
No.
they do that?
They the piston in almost all these CO2 engines has a pin as part of the piston, and that opens a ball valve in the head when it hits top dead center.
On the Cox, how did they do that?
Okay. He used a slightly larger diameter ball
Oh, it just
than
touched it.
you would normally do, and enough of it protrudes down that it runs into the
Wow.
Standard piston.
flat top piston and moves the ball, opens the ball, and
So-
puts the CO2 in.
My question earlier was, did anybody take one of these motors and gear it and like run a helicopter rotor for free flight or RC?
Who would do a thing like that?
I know.
He's
He's
there.
there.
Tremendous torque.
That guy.
Me?
Yeah.
I didn't run it.
No, who would do that?
Oh, I would.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
And it was a friend of mine and I, who also had CO2 engines, thought that this would be great fun to have a real live. There was a helicopter that was published in the model magazines called the Penny, which was rubber band powered and had a thread that ran the tail rotor. So Steve, had the same engines, the two-cylinder engine, but we had entirely different design helicopters. I used slack car gears and had a drive shaft and bevel gears for the tail rotor, and it was a profile of a Jet Ranger, and Steve's was entirely different. He used the thread pulley to the back, and it was frustrating because we didn't really know a whole lot about the helicopter other than the Penny.
They look cool though, right?
Well, they look cool, but and this was multiple years we were doing this. We had in the wintertime we flew on Friday nights at a high school gym, a lot of Friday nights. So we would go and try, and things would explode, and super glue had come out by now, so we could exactly. It turned out after, I don't know, year and a half, 2 years of experimenting doing this, the same night we got these two entirely different design helicopters to fly. And you start the engine by flipping the engine and start it, and it would wind up, and we could let it go, and then it would very slowly start to drift. And as it drifted, got going fast enough, the tail fin would point it in the direction it was going. And then it would go out and fly around like a free flight model. And the neat thing about a CO2 engine is it doesn't just stop running. It slows down. So it would come in and land on the gym floor and slide along and then spool down.
Applause. Yeah.
And that was pretty amazing, if I do say so. And yes, I actually have a picture of it right as it launched.
So was it? You let the motor spin up and then you engaged it? What was the?
It was mine was actually geared directly, and so that was a little bit rough.
Yeah.
But we had an overrunning clutch, so if the rotor, when the engine stopped, the rotor could spin down. It didn't come to a halt, suddenly. Originally, we had heads that would drop the pitch of the blade so that they could auto rotate, but we didn't need it.
You didn't need a flywheel on the motor itself.
Yes, we did have a
Oh,
flywheel.
you did have a flywheel.
Yeah,
That sounds so cool.
it was interesting. So
One thing, again, these are very high torque motors. On the OK Cub 049, on OK CO2s,
Right.
I run 10 to 12 inch props. They'll have these little 5 inch props or something on them, just totally inefficient.
Right.
I hate big props. But
most all of these planes that I fly, the props are much bigger than they were supplied, engines were supplied with. Keep in mind that the CO2 is at 1,000 psi. I think in an internal combustion engine, the combustion pressures are about 180 psi. So these are very high torque, and they're more efficient running them slow, turning 3 big propellers.
What would it cost, or what would it take for, let's say, a guy like me to get started with a CO2 motor from scratch these days?
Your only real option is to buy something off of eBay, and the engines appear fairly regularly, and they're really not that much more. Sometimes not that much more expensive than they sold for originally. Chargers are hard to come by. So if you find those, you know, that's the hard part. So typically you use a CO2 cartridge, and Bill was one of the first ones to use a 12 gram CO2 cartridge, which was a good improvement, you know. So for the Brown engines, there are a number of rubber seals in the filler valve, where the tube goes into the engine, and in the charger itself. And all those seals have died of old age now. I got introduced to Bill because I was hang gliding not too far from where his shop was, and had got introduced to him. So I used to go up and spend 2 or 3 days a year, you know, spend the day with him. And I was interested in his tooling, and, you know, had questions. And he was very proud of all the tooling, because it was all done on very, very simple equipment. Nowadays, with the CNC equipment like Gasparin had, it wouldn't be a problem. But Bill did a lot of it on 12-inch Atlas lathes that he had modified, and very simple, you know, tooling. And when I finally had enough nerve to make the punches that he had showed me, I discovered that I could punch out these seals. I've got better rubber than Bill had. So I have the ability of, you know, fixing up any of the Brown engines. I also ended up inheriting all the parts that were left over. So if you've got a good piston and cylinder, I can probably rebuild an engine to the shape it was in when it was brand new.
Yeah, so I actually, because I got that sharp job, I've been
Right.
looking at this. So 50 to 150, you could probably find something if you wait long enough on eBay.
Right.
The last 2 motors I bought on eBay as a package cost me $40.
Better.
So it's eBay. It's all over the map, right?
Yeah, it's all over the map.
Right. Occasionally there's going to be stuff no one else has noticed, and occasionally there's going to be stuff everybody wants.
Right.
But it sounds like you're getting someone else's old
Yes.
stuff.
Yes.
So you
But
gotta
a lot of
compare
cases it's new in the package and never been.
Wasn't there still a small stock of relatively new Gasparin stuff?
Yes, there is in
That-
Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, that I think they're still selling.
They are.
Those are money, because I mean they're
Right.
beautiful works of art.
But if you're actually going to fly them, look at the G63 or the G120s, you know, or the reasonable size. He's got real tiny engines and multi-cylinder engines, you know. But those two would be practical free flight, you know, entry, and those are the only new engines that are available. Again, if you've got a Brown, I could probably restore it for you to runnable condition.
The multi-cylinders are very inefficient. They're fun to look at, but you gain very little from the second cylinder.
They become a little bit smoother because the firing impulse is so violent. Ross has figured this out on the RC model. At certain low RPMs, the whole airplane is shaking because the impulse is pretty high. So the 2-cylinder engines are alternate firing, so it smooths that out a little bit. But you're probably better off with the 6-cylinder engine. Anybody else have any questions?
Joe, I thought you might have said that the B100, the Brown 100,
Right.
was the best, you know, among all the CO2 engines. That's the experience I had during the years that we were playing with.
Sure. The Beacon 100, you know, was the epitome of what, you know, the designs. So again, Bill started off with a hardened steel piston for the first 500 of the 005s. Then he changed to a plastic piston because it was simpler. Fairly quickly he discovered that it imposed a whole different set of problems, and it wasn't up to his standards. And the English could go build the plastic piston engines, and he would go back to the hardened steel pistons. So he did that with the B100s, the later production of the A23s, and of the GB12. You know, all had a hardened steel piston. So those are the engines that you're looking for. The ones Browns with the steel pistons are the best ones, in my opinion.